So one of the more interesting things about humans, in my opinion, is how susceptible we are to accepting ideas or believing things to be true simply because there's a large number of people out there that believe that idea. And it makes sense if you think about it. Like if there's one guy on the street spouting off some insane idea, you're much less likely to believe that than if, 1,000 or 10,000 people believe that idea. And if there was 1,000 people out there that you trust in other areas, then you're even more likely to just take everybody's word for that idea. So the funny thing about this is that, culture kind of works like this. Culture, what is it? It's like this group of people all kind of living in a place, moving in a direction together loosely. People might be bickering amongst the group. But in general, the majority seem to support these ideas, and then we call them cultural norms. And so sometimes, when cultural norms are up for debate, there might be multiple ways of doing things. People disagree. People are talking about maybe the best way to do it, and this might even become political in a way. You've got different political parties representing different ideas. But on the other hand, you might have other cultural norms that are almost universally accepted and universally enforced. There might be a few people out on the fringe kind of trying to, push back against these cultural norms. But in general, people support these ideas. So if this goes far enough, a cultural norm isn't even really viewed as a norm anymore. It's not viewed as an optional thing. It's almost viewed as something that's just innately built into us humans. And a lot of religious norms are like this. They're not up for debate. It's basically handed to a religious person, the way human beings are or the way the world came about. And it's just kind of expected at that point that you take that as truth. So when this type of thing happens, these types of people will look at people who aren't following the norms almost as dangerous. They're not supporting the status quo and therefore are dangerous to themselves, dangerous to others, and damaging to culture in general. So one thing that I've just been thinking a lot about lately is relationships in this context and all the cultural norms that are associated with relationships. And of course, depending on where you live, relationships will change and the cultural norms will change from place to place. I live in Canada, so, Canada, United States, general Western culture, it's sort of kind of universal in this area of relationships. So in many things, we have multiple options in culture and we're able to freely choose. Sort of like going to a restaurant, they give you a menu and you can choose what you want to eat. In the area of relationships though, and what I've been realizing is that it's like a menu with a single item on it. If you want to be accepted by culture, if you want to be treated as healthy and in control and not dangerous and damaging, you really are sort of forced into this one way of looking at relationships. So if we had to put a name on this type of relationship that's prevalent in our culture, it would be something like monogamous, cohabitating romantic relationships. So not too long ago, I came upon this other word, the relationship escalator. Maybe it's something you've heard about. It's often used by people who seem to be trying to get off the escalator. And so I wanted to learn more about this, so I've been reading about it. And there's a book I was reading called Stepping Off the Relationship Escalator. So in general, what is the relationship escalator? It's basically just describing the obvious steps that culture expects you to take in the process of building a relationship. This goes all the way from first meeting a person and like flirting, all the way to living the rest of your life with them and eventually till death do you part. And the reality is it's actually an amazing analogy, this escalator, because it's not a staircase, it is an escalator, because you're always expected to keep moving up. And when you're on one step of the escalator, there's always another step to get to. And once you get to that step, you never move backwards. You can't really get off the escalator without breaking up the relationship. And even if you're the type of person who doesn't like this kind of thing, having labels put on you and being told what to do, it seems to me that culture will almost force you into these steps. So what are some characteristics of the typical romantic relationship in our culture? So first and foremost, it's expected when you get into a romantic relationship that that relationship essentially takes priority over all other relationships in your life. even your best friends that you've been friends with forever. As soon as you get into this romantic situation, this person is your new priority. So this goes on from there. You're expected to be each other's sole source of attraction and your sole source of physical and sexual intimacy. But at the same time, there's this element that they should be your best friend. So it's this lover and friendship kind of wrapped into one. Of course, this person is also the person you will have children with. So they're a co-parent. You might, have various business activities with them. So they're almost like a business partner. So of course, you're expected to live together. And because you have joint finances, you buy this house together. So they're almost like a roommate and a co-property manager as well. And then a lot of your recreational time in your life, or you're traveling, it's almost like this person becomes a travel buddy and, maybe a sports buddy. Basically, your whole life essentially is expected to be wrapped around and organized around this romantic relationship. So along with all these roles, there's a number of other expectations that you're kind of expected to take on. Number one, you're supposed to, love and cherish this person in a very specific way. And so that involves having eyes for nobody else. It's almost considered a bad thing if you admit attractiveness towards other people. There's almost an accepted level of jealousy involved, where if the other person deviates at all from these expectations, that culture almost expects you to be jealous. So in general, culture, especially religious culture, and I come from a Christian background. That's how I was raised, even though at this point I've kind of stepped away from that. The idea of marriage is extremely ingrained to the point where, in many religious circles, you're not supposed to have sex before marriage. Marriage is this almost holy thing that, I was taught from a very young age, right? God has this person for me and they're out there somewhere. And if I, save myself until marriage, God will reward me and I will have a healthier, stronger marriage as a result. In my upbringing in that whole Christian culture, not getting married and just having a relationship where you live with somebody was basically not an option on the table. And if you did that, and the people that did do that were essentially shamed either into marriage or almost just treated like, sinners or outcasts. And the interesting thing about our culture is there are a lot of, even if you're not religious, even people that aren't really Christian, there's a lot of religious underpinning to our culture. A lot of the laws and the norms and the ideas come from this whole sort of European religious culture. So it's actually something really interesting to me. Even people that aren't religious seem to uphold a lot of religious norms. And of course, the religious people almost use that as evidence to kind of say, we're built for these types of relationships. God designed us for this, one man, one woman monogamous relationship. And anything outside of that is a deviation that should be, treated as dangerous or shameful. So within the context of this relationship, it's assumed that children, this is the best way to raise children within this, so they can learn the system themselves. They can learn what relationships are. They can learn what love is from their parents who are partaking in this very specific relationship style. So it's kind of the way that the relationship style is passed on to new generations. So as part of this relationship system, it's assumed that these relationships last for a long time or forever, essentially. I've never been to a wedding before where they say, well, we'll try this out for 5 or 10 years, and then maybe we'll reevaluate and see how it's working out. Obviously, that's not how it works. In general, that till death do us part is part of the vows, and most people have the intention to try to make this relationship work until the end. Of course, more than half of relationships don't actually make it to the end. And it's kind of a funny thing in a way, right? Because nobody goes into a marriage thinking that they're going to be one of the people that break up. So there's obviously something going on here outside of our expectations, outside of our control. People are having troubles within the confines of their marriages or their long-term relationships that aren't really expected. So after you are married and you inevitably grow and change throughout your life, you're essentially expected to grow and change together and essentially tolerate each other until the end. This is a really funny thing in a way, because I don't know if it's possible really to predict how you might change or how your values might change or how you might change your beliefs. And if a relationship is sort of formed around a certain belief, value, or just a similarity that eventually goes away, that can be really hard in a relationship. And it's something that you can't really predict or see. So despite this, and despite the fact that, more than half of marriages fail in the end, we all go into it with this expectation that it will last and that we are not going to be one of those 50% that actually, does call it quits. So the reason why it's an escalator and not a staircase is there's always this forward momentum. You're always moving up the staircase. For example, you first meet somebody. You don't sort of just stay in that initial fling stage forever. You either drift apart or you move to the next stage, which would be, let's say, you're more like officially dating, and then you're exclusive, and this keeps going until marriage, and then all the way up until you've had this long-term relationship. At any stage in the process, it's always expected that you keep moving. You never see anybody moving backwards on the escalator. If you do see somebody attempting that, usually that means they're probably going to break up, or it's expected to break up. For example, if somebody is engaged to be married, that would be, moving up a step on the escalator, and it's kind of the expected step. Let's say you've been together for 3 or 4 or 5 years or whatever. People start to ask you, like, when are you getting married? Are you guys going to get married? When I was young and I got married, we'd been dating for about 3 years. And it just, even though I was so young, when I think back, 22, I basically knew nothing at 22. It's shocking that people allowed me to actually get married at that age. I look back at it and I remember actually this one thing my dad said. I don't want to pick on my dad because he's just another victim of this whole system, all these norms that are forced on us. And he was just doing the best he could at the time. But I remember him saying, well, there comes a time where you either break up or you get married. And that right there is a perfect embodiment of the escalator. You keep moving up or you get off the escalator. There is no way to just stay at one step and have everybody be okay with you. So I saw this perfect example from Dexter. The other day I've been watching a little bit of Dexter. And so Deb and Quinn, they're 2 characters in the show. They're dating and even living together. They were clearly at a certain step on the relationship escalator. They were dating/living together. And Quinn clearly wants to, move forward to the next step, which is marriage, and moving into an engagement. And you're engaged for a time and then you get married. But Deb didn't really want to do that. She was happy with where they were and almost would just have stayed in that current situation, in that step. But it's funny, you can tell just from the writing, Quinn, that's expected that you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to stay at that step. You either progress or you break up. So in this case, we ended up breaking up. Perfect example. So I'm going to run through the steps of the escalator really quick. And the reason why I'm going to do it is you'll notice that this almost perfectly describes the typical relationship in our culture. And sure, there's a few deviations here and there, but in general, these are the steps you're pretty much expected to follow. So number 1, which would be making contact. Maybe you meet, there's a bit of flirting, there's some kind of social encounter. It's quite casual. And, in certain situations or certain types of cultures, there might be some hooking up or making out, just some casual encounters. In the Christian culture that I grew up in, maybe not so much of that. So step 2 is initiation of the relationship. So there might be, some more romantic gestures, some courting going on. So now there's some emotional investment that starts to happen and this feeling of falling in love from both parties. So there might be some sexual contact at this point, unless somebody is sort of in one of those strict religious systems where the sexual contact is expected to wait until a later step. in the escalator. So step 3 is interesting. It's basically where you claim and define the relationship. It's like a claiming of the other person. So there's a mutual declaration of love, and now you present yourself as a couple in public. So there's usually an adoption of the common relationship labels, boyfriend, girlfriend. So at this step, there's also expectations that are put onto either person. So it's like, well, you're my boyfriend now, so here's all the expectations of a boyfriend. Well, you're my girlfriend now, here's all the expectations of a girlfriend. And the interesting thing about a lot of these expectations is they're not actually discussed or talked about. It's just expected. They're almost like miniature covert contracts. People will expect this person to behave like a boyfriend when there's really been no discussion to, say what a boyfriend is in their definition. And to me, this is part of the problem. These things aren't created by people to meet their lives, to meet their own, ideas or their own values or what they want. It's just adopted. So along with this step, people often become exclusive, and that monogamy part of it, starts. The dating apps get deleted off the phone. All those other potential girlfriends and boyfriends, they sort of go no contact on those, or they're just friends. So once all this is sort of secured, it's assumed at this point that until you leave the relationship, until you explicitly leave, you are in the relationship indefinitely. Step 4 might be establishment. So in the last step, it kind of claimed and defined the person. And now in the establishment phase, it's sort of like adapting to this new life. You've got this new person in your life, creating new routines and patterns around this relationship. There's expectations of continually spending time with each other. So you're, continually rearranging your life around these schedules in order to make time for each other. Number 5 is commitment, which is sort of approaching that, engagement phase in a way. It's basically securing your long-term future with this person and discussing that aspect of the future. At this point, there's almost this accountability for each other and your whereabouts at all times. It's not like you're leaving for a week and you don't tell the other person where you're going. You are at that point seen as a couple, and you're expected to kind of behave that way. Everything you do is sort of discussed and planned together. Part of this is there's expectations around meeting each other's families and sort of declaring yourselves as a long-term couple to the family. So number 6 is emerging, and I think this can come in multiple ways. Traditionally speaking, people get married, a merging of finances, you move in together, you buy a house together, you agree to almost some legal definitions of what you mean to each other, and you, at this point, often get the government involved in defining your relationship. And culture and government, rewards you for this, and you get certain tax breaks and write-offs, and there's all kinds of cultural benefits towards these types of couples. So in a way, you're almost celebrated for taking this step. So let's say at this point, you don't really have the best relationship. Let's say there's some emotional abuse in this relationship. Let's say you're just really not compatible for each other. But let's say you're stuck in a trauma bond, or one person has a personality disorder, one person's codependent. Anyway, there's all kinds of reasons why this relationship may not be that great. The point is that culture celebrates you and rewards you for this relationship, kind of no matter if the relationship actually is healthy. So number 7 is kind of the conclusion, and it is that you are married and is expected to stay this way until death in most cases. If you leave a relationship after the conclusion phase, you will likely have all kinds of problems. You'll have to get divorced. You'll have a tremendous amount of cultural shaming. You will lose friends. It's made very clear to you at that point that that is not what you're supposed to do. So as a person who has gone through a separation and a divorce, I can really attest to that. It's amazing the kind of shame you receive when you go through this, even from people that you thought were your friends. People will completely turn on you simply for leaving a relationship that really has nothing to do with them. The most perplexing thing to me about the relationship escalator and the way culture treats it is even if you don't want to be on it, people will still push these norms onto you. Like, let's say you get married and I'm a man. Naturally, my female friends that I'm really close with will start to distance themselves from me naturally, sort of against my will. It's just part of the image of being a man in a marriage. You don't have these close female friends. That's assuming you're heterosexual. If you're gay, then people seem to sort of rewrite these rules in different ways, and now you're allowed to do other things. People, even if you don't really want to be seen as a couple, people will still view you as a couple, and they will start to refer to you as a couple. They will say Bob and Sally. And if Bob starts to do things that kind of go against the cultural norms of the relationship, he could be, talked poorly about behind his back. Or let's say Sally isn't kind of living up to the expectations of what culture thinks that relationship should look like. She could receive some shame as well. Statistically speaking, most people, greater than 50%, fail at the relationship escalator. Let's just say, for example, it is 50%. So 50% of the people fall off the escalator. They receive a bunch of cultural shaming. They're slapped on the wrist for doing so. But the rest of these people, it's not a success in most cases. I heard one stat out there that, only 15% of marriages, so, the other 50% here that actually do make it, only 15% of them are like very fulfilled in their relationships. A lot of people are kind of just making it work. Lots of people are in really bad situations, but they're still staying in that relationship. They're actually making themselves miserable. They're tolerating all kinds of abuse simply because of the pressures to stay on the escalator. And maybe you've heard me talk about this before, but to me, if you have a high level of control in a relationship, it's going to damage the relationship, and you will never really experience the freedom of what a relationship should or could be. It's sort of like a best friend, right? Like if you have a best friend, it's almost like the purest form of a relationship, almost more pure than a romantic relationship, is what I've started to wonder. Because there's no legal contract saying you guys have to be together. There's no cultural norms that define exactly what a best friend does. If you guys want to hang out 3 days a week and you have this deep level of emotional intimacy, that's perfectly fine. If you want to live with your best friend as a roommate, that's considered perfectly fine. If you live on completely different sides of the country and you see each other hardly ever, that's still fine. It's not like people say, well, no, you can't be a best friend and do that. It's funny to me that the definition of best friend essentially survives any situation. But a romantic relationship, on the other hand, does not survive any situation. If you said, I'm going to be married, but I'm going to live in a different country, it's like red flag. That's not a romantic relationship, right? If you're like, actually, I'm going to put my friends higher priority than my romantic relationship, people will be like, that's not okay. That's not a romantic relationship. Or what if you said, I'm going to have 2 partners? That's like polyamory. There's lots of people who do that. People go, oh, that doesn't work. You can't have a healthy relationship in that context, which is sort of contrary to the stats, actually, if you look it up. Culture says that relationships must have sex to be a fulfilling relationship. Well, what happens if you're kind of an asexual person and you don't even really like having sex? Now this person is that a romantic relationship? Culture kind of says maybe not, right? That's more like a best friend. You're just emotionally close, but not sexually. I think what I'm getting at here is that to be on the escalator requires control. There's an element of control telling you exactly what you can or can't do in order to be in that relationship. And part of me wonders if a romantic relationship, can really flourish under those circumstances, under this high level of control. So something I've been asking myself is, what would a romantic relationship look like if we treated it the same way we treat best friends? And by that I mean people are allowed to define their own relationships to kind of meet their own needs, meet their own wants. Would that work? within the confines of an escalator relationship, if you have friends of the opposite sex, close friends, it's almost considered that you're having an emotional affair. Well, what if you allowed that? I think one of the biggest things about the relationship escalator is this obsession with having relationships last. And if they don't last, there's all this shame associated with it. And I guess I just don't know if that makes sense. I think it's inevitable that as people grow, they may change. So you have two people that might have similar values and then they split apart and they've changed their beliefs. Should a Muslim and a Christian be forced to be in this relationship together when they really can't stand each other? Should two people that have had their values changed, should they be forced to be each other's sole attraction? So anyway, these are just a few things I've been thinking about. This is just sort of an intro to this topic, and there's lots of other things I could talk about. If there's anything that you're kind of wondering or some ideas if you have of your own, feel free to put them in the comments, or if you have a question or if you have something that you'd like to hear my thoughts on related to this, let me know. Otherwise, thanks for joining me today, and I hope you got something out of this. Okay, see ya.